Video, we're going to talk a little bit more about fiscal policy and specifically what the government can do during a recession when GDP shrinks and the unemployment rate goes up. And one of the things that's important to remember in the United States especially is that government spending depends on three levels of government: the federal government, the state government, and the local government. And while the federal government usually takes the lead in fiscal policy, that's mainly because they have the ability to borrow much more easily than state or local governments do. And so it's much easier for the federal government to increase spending or transfers when we have a recession. So what causes a recession anyway? Well, in order to think about that, we need to think about aggregate demand. So remember that aggregate demand is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending, plus government spending, plus exports minus imports. And so recessions are usually caused by a drop in aggregate demand. It could be any piece of aggregate demand, but it's usually consumer spending or business or residential investment. Remember, residential investment means just building new houses. And then this can be made worse through the multiplier process because it's always important to remember that one person's spending is another person's income. So when spending falls, that means that somebody else's income falls. And when their income falls, that means their spending is likely to fall as well. And that's what the multiplier process is all about. So in our simplified version of aggregate demand, we focus just on consumer spending and investment. And we look at consumer spending as made up of two pieces. One is independent of income, what's often called autonomous consumption, C0. Which will depend on wealth, will depend on expectations, will depend on what people just need to consume to survive. And then the other piece depends on the marginal propensity to consume, which is equal to C1 times income. And remember that the marginal propensity to consume is less than 1 because when you get an additional dollar of income, you can either spend that dollar or save that dollar. And in this model, we assume that investment does not depend on current income. As we'll see when we talk about monetary policy, investment depends more on the interest rate as well as business expectations. So we can solve for the equilibrium by just saying, all right, well, output is equal to aggregate demand, Y equals AD. And for aggregate demand, we just put in our formulas for consumer spending and investment. So Y equals C0 plus C1Y, that's consumer spending, plus investment. And then just solve for Y. We move the C1 times Y over to the left-hand side, we factor out the Y, and we divide through by 1 minus C1. And so we get Y equals 1 over 1 minus C1, that's our multiplier in this model, times the autonomous consumption, C0, plus investment. I'm not worried too much about the math. We'll look more at the graph here. So if we graph this, then we can see that autonomous consumption is the intercept of our consumption function, and then the slope of the consumption function is the marginal propensity to consume. And similarly, once we add investment spending, because it doesn't depend on current income, it just shifts up the consumption function into aggregate demand. And so now the intercept is C0 plus I, and the slope is still C1, the marginal propensity to consume. Now what's equilibrium? Well, our axes here, the vertical axis is aggregate demand and the horizontal axis is output or income, Y. And so the 45-degree line shows all the points where those two are equal. And so our equilibrium in this model is just going to be where aggregate demand crosses the 45-degree line, where output equals aggregate demand, or point A in this case. So if we have a recession, what can government do? Well, they can increase government spending directly. They can increase transfers, that's like unemployment benefits. They can spend on other projects like infrastructure. They can spend on roads and bridges and the electrical grid, on schools, on everything that the government spends money on, and therefore put income into the pockets of people who work on those projects. Or they can cut taxes to try to increase other spending. So consumer spending depends on disposable income, right? Income minus taxes. And so if you can cut taxes, you can increase disposable income and hope that consumers spend it. The problem is that there's a risk that that extra income will just be saved. And this was especially true during the Great Recession because people had felt that their target wealth, their actual wealth was below their target wealth. And because their housing equity had fallen so dramatically with the housing bust. And so most of that increased disposable income they got from the tax cuts was really just saved to try to get their target wealth back to where people wanted it. So there's really two types of fiscal policy. There are automatic stabilizers and there's discretionary fiscal policy. Automatic stabilizers depend on laws that were passed before, sometime in the past, and they go into effect as soon as a recession hits. So it's something like unemployment benefits, right? We didn't have unemployment benefits during the Great Depression, and that meant that if you lost your job, you lost your income. Now, if you lose your job, you lose a significant portion of your income, but you don't lose it all because you're eligible to collect unemployment benefits. Another piece of automatic stabilizers is progressive taxation, which means that the tax rate that you pay increases as your income increases. Well, during a recession, people's income tends to fall, which means that their tax rates fall, so that disposable income doesn't fall by as much as market income. Discretionary fiscal policy requires a new law, like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. The problem with discretionary fiscal policy is that it's slower, right? Congress and the president have to agree on some policy, or state governments and governors. It's political, so it means that you have to make compromises about where the spending should happen, whether it should be spending or tax cuts. And that often means that it's less well targeted than the automatic stabilizers. For example, in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which was about $800 billion of fiscal stimulus, it ended up being about half tax cuts and half spending, when most economists think that direct spending has a more powerful effect on the economy than do the tax cuts. But of course, Republicans wanted tax cuts, Democrats wanted spending, and so a compromise was reached. So one of the things that's important to remember is that the federal government is able to borrow much more easily by selling government bonds, what are called Treasury bills and Treasury bonds, than our state governments or local governments. And so during a recession, when tax revenue falls and spending increases, they're more likely to have to borrow. And so that's much easier for the federal government than for any other level of government. And this is what allows the government to conduct this counter-cyclical fiscal policy, meaning that spending goes up during a recession and then falls during an expansion. Taxes go up during an expansion and fall during a recession. If the federal government wasn't able to borrow, if nobody wanted to buy the U.S. government bonds, then it wouldn't be able to conduct this counter-cyclical fiscal policy, and it wouldn't really be able to do fiscal policy at all unless it built up a large, rainy day fund like, maybe like Norway has with their oil wealth. We could do that. It's just politically more difficult. So let's think about what fiscal policy is actually trying to do. So here is our formula for our more complicated aggregate demand. So we have consumption spending is C0 plus C1 times disposable income, Y minus T, plus investment, which depends on the interest rate R, plus government spending, plus net exports. Now there isn't a whole lot the government can do about net exports. So the first thing to remember from our model is that the equilibrium is where aggregate demand is equal to output. That's the 45-degree line. So imagine we are at some higher level of output at an equilibrium. We'll call that AD1. And then we get a recession. And the recession could come about because of a decrease in any type of spending, right? It could be consumer spending, it could be business spending. Those are usually the two main culprits. Or it could be a fall in residential investment, which was one of the main causes of the Great Recession, right? We had built up a whole lot of houses because of the housing bubble. We said, oh, houses are really worth a lot. Let's build a lot of them. And then at some point, we realized we had built too many, and so we stopped building them. And when you stop building them, that means construction workers aren't getting paid, architects aren't getting paid, engineers aren't getting paid. A whole bunch of people sees their income fall, And as well as people seeing their wealth fall, which means that they increase saving and decrease spending, and we get a big drop in aggregate demand. And so through the multiplier process, output falls somewhat dramatically. And so now the government wants to try to do something with fiscal policy, right? So the automatic stabilizers kick in, we get unemployment benefits, tax revenue goes down, but it looked like we needed to do more, right? And so the Bush administration gave a tax rebate in 2008. And then when the Obama administration came in 2009, it passed, along with Congress, the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which both increased government spending, G, and cut taxes, little t here. So the idea was that we would be able to shift aggregate demand back to where it was. Was it successful? It was not completely successful, to be completely honest. We probably shifted aggregate demand some back to where, in the direction we wanted it to go, but not enough. And frankly, it took a long time to recover from the Great Recession. So what happens to the government budget during a recession? Well, we can think of the budget balance, which is often called SG for government savings, as equal to taxes minus spending minus transfers, or T minus G minus TR. If SG is less than 0, that means the government has a budget deficit. If SG is larger than 0, that means it has a budget surplus. Now, one thing to remember is that a lot of state governments can't really run a budget deficit. Most state governments have constitutional amendments that say it has to run a balanced budget. So when there's a budget deficit, they either have to decrease spending or increase taxes. The federal government can run a budget deficit, right? And so we would expect larger deficits during recessions and smaller ones during expansions due to fiscal policy, and that is in fact what we saw. In fact, we saw the biggest budget deficit since World War II in 2009. It reached about 10% of GDP, which is quite large, and now it's back down to around 3% of GDP. So the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, combined with the automatic stabilizers, increased the deficits substantially.